Thank you. I'm grateful that I'm feeling well enough to stand up and give this lecture. I was quite sick this morning, thanks to Denise. I think that's where it got, but thank God I'm feeling better. I'd like to say something in view of the weather here. I didn't expect it. But there's an old limerick that perhaps represents how Canadians feel about this sort of thing, and it goes, "There was a young man from Quebec who was buried in snow to his neck. When asked, 'Is you frizz?' he replied, 'Yes, I is, but we don't call these cold in Quebec.'" And the same goes for Alberta. But nevertheless, it was a nuisance. Again, my disclaimer, I am not a biologist. I'm a physicist, physical scientist, interested in the philosophy and history of science, and inevitably, therefore, in the issues that are currently being debated within the Christian community about evolutionary biology. My comments in this talk, I think, are at least partially defensible, and they're reasonably up to date. I can say no more than that. Secondly, I'd like to make a personal comment that I have some sympathy with the theory of evolution for quite unusual reasons, theological reasons. You'll note if you read the New Testament, the profound emphasis on the intent of the freedom of creation. You remember that St. Paul, in that rather incredible passage in chapter 8, speaks of creation being set free from its bondage to decay and obtaining the glorious liberty of the children of God. Well, you can make of that what you like, but it's very clear that one of the themes, and I was assured by this by Dan Hardy, who was in fact the director of the center in Princeton the year I was there, that this is an important theme, and what goes along with it is the generosity of God. Because God not only wants his creatures to be free, but if you ask what Genesis 1 is about, here's one perspective. He's giving everything away. It's all yours. Of course, I want you to be responsible, but it's all yours. Lavish. And Paul says this, doesn't he, in Ephesians 1, his lavish generosity in Christ. And he has to be talking about Genesis 1. That's the proof text, if you like. Now, Genesis 1 differs very strikingly from Origen's narratives of other cultures. It really isn't about the process of creation. At least I don't think so. For the Torah, Exodus 21 through 3 and following, which is where the Decalogue is stated, is really an important starting point for understanding Torah, so I understand from people who are far more serious scholars than I am of the Old Testament. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Out of the house of bondage you shall have no other gods beside me." And you can parse that as you like, but the point is that's who I am. Now, if you want to know some more, we can go to Genesis 1. By the way, I made the heavens and the earth. I think it's Christopher Kaiser who makes that point in his book it's called The Doctrine of God or something like that. I knew Chris Kaiser because he was a student and close friend of Thomas Torrance, Jr., whom I also knew. Now, the second narrative, Genesis 2, of course, tells a great deal more about who God is in the context of the history of the people of the covenant, starting with Adam and Eve. And I'm not going to comment on that. And also, I suppose, in the historical sense, because it's a perspective set within earth and not within the eternal perspectives of God, as Genesis 1 is an account of God's fidelity to his creatures in the face of really rather bad performance on their part. Did you ever notice, said one of the people at Regent College to me, that every single one of the families of the promised covenant is dysfunctional? It's a significant fact. Helps us if we have functionality problems in families. Genesis 1 is concerned, as I said, with the eternal purposes and the lavish generosity of God. Finally, the literary structure of Genesis 1, I think, supports this idea. My view of it, the literary view that I have, it's come from Henri Blocher in a little book called In the Beginning. And Henri Blocher more or less lays out the following plan. Excuse me. Verse 2 gives a prospectus. If you're into business and finance, that might be a way of describing it, or a plan. The earth was without form and empty, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And I'm not going to comment on the second clause. The important point is that the earth was without form and void. And the 6 days of creation which follow are divided into 2 sets of 3. And the marked characteristic of the first 3 days is that God creates spaces. He gives form to creation. Green grass isn't included in a deliberate thing because the Hebrews didn't think of plants as being creatures in a living sense. I think it's just the nature of the culture. But the key word in the first 3 days is divide, separate one realm from another. And so God is creating or giving form. And then in the second 3 days, almost in direct order of the domains that are described and created in the first 3 days, God populates those domains. The fourth day, the fourth day things that Howard Van Til talked about in one of his books, it's about the sun, moon, and stars. And one of the significant things that's said there's of course all kinds of polemic material that's there if you're looking for it, and I'm sure it's there, because the Hebrews are living in cultures around them which are worshiping the heavens. And one of the things that's said about the sun, moon, and the stars, particularly with respect to the Babylonian culture, he made the stars also. Beautiful line. Beautiful line. Because what really matters is the sun to give light and to provide seasons and years, and the moon plays the same role. But a significant fact is that God does not bless these bodies. And their regularity is emphasized, and that's what it's about. They're there for you, and there is another, perhaps facetious, between the lines gloss. Don't worship them, they're bureaucrats. Okay? But when God makes the living creatures, the creatures that fly in the heavens and the creatures that swim in the seas, very specifically, and God blessed them. Now, what does a blessing mean? I have sometimes tried, when speaking to young people, to try to get this idea across, that perhaps in the slangiest possible statement, God is saying, do your thing. In other words, whatever capacities are innate within the character of the thing that you are, do it. And so God isn't interested in keeping them from, quote, fooling around. And here I'm not intending any intentionality. It's just that liberty is implicit in God's command. I'm setting you free. And we do not bless. I don't know what you mean or what you understand, but I think we're all pretty well parts of the same culture. What does it mean when parents give their blessing to a young couple who are going to get married? What are we admitting as parents if we do that? We're saying you can function on your own, you have your own life, and while I may worry and pray for, and indeed sometimes be horrified by choices you make, nevertheless, they're your choices. I'm not any longer responsible for your choices. You have a genuine liberty and a potentiality for development on your own, and your family is your family. And my goodness, that's right. That's the way it should be. And parents now are out of the picture. It's hard for parents to learn that. But it seems to me that's what's implicit when giving blessing to those close to us. And as I read about blessing in various parts of the Old Testament, I hear various degrees of this understanding. And so I think it's at least my bias in terms of interpretation of this text that God's blessing implies that the living creation has some kind of capability that the sun, moon, and stars don't. And that's why they aren't blessed, because it's fourth-day stuff. Now, I don't draw any metaphysical conclusions from that other than that there are differences that are manifest in the capacity of biological organisms, whether we do it by random mutation or spontaneous mutation or whatever. Changes happen and forms change and develop. And that's all I meant. And that this is okay with God. I guess an old man should occasionally tell a story. I tell a story in my manuscript of the 5th chapter. Years ago, I was teaching a course on origins at Regent College, and there was a Chinese fellow there. It was a classic product, or had been a classic product, of the People's Republic. He was not necessarily a Communist Party member. You could tell them because they were dumber than the others. Pardon my comment, but at least that's how we in the staff thought, that there were very few Communist Party members who were as smart as the others who came to us from the PR. And one of these boys, and I think he was normally intelligent, certainly, had been a product of this educational system across the ocean. And he had gone to, or was going, and I think had completed a graduate degree, whether it was a master's degree or a PhD, I do not know. He didn't call himself doctor, and I tried to not raise the issue. But he fell in with the Chinese Christian Fellowship. Now, if you look into it, you'll find that in many cases, there is a history of Christianity in the lives of people who come with apparently completely neutral religious frames. And I don't know his story, but he became a Christian. And here he was at Regent College and had completely adopted and become convinced that young earth creationism was correct, and that evolution never happened, and so on. And he sees toward the end of the week that I'm kind of edging toward that question, and he gets more and more upset. And finally, in the last day, he just blurts it out. He says, "You mean you really believe that living organisms are capable of altering and even going macroevolution?" And he had all these words that he was trying to grab hold of. I said, "Yeah." We said, "Then God wouldn't be sovereign." And that blew me away for a minute. I was sort of half praying, because you sometimes pray when you're in argument with someone. And I said, "Well, okay, I admit there might be some minimal threat to God's sovereignty involved in biological evolution, but have you considered the much greater threat whenever we talk to each other?" You got the point. That's a very important point, actually. And I'm grateful to God for showing it to me. That God is so sovereign that nothing even you or I decide affects that fundamental lordship of His. And yet our freedom is real, isn't it? We all believe that we are free to make choices. And in fact, I used to argue back when I lived here as a catchword, but I still believe it, that our interest in the truth arises because we believe ourselves to be free. And the consequence, if you like, in the most romantic way, is that through our choices, truth can shape the future. That's a positive and benevolent view of our freedom. Of course, other stuff happens, and I'm not going to go there either. So I see God's blessing of the living creatures, which is repeated after the creation of the human beings and the land creatures. Again, be fruitful, multiply, spread. And I see that as a command to be free. And Paul gives us this wonderful account in Romans 8 when he says that creation will at last, when human beings have been brought to real liberty through Jesus Christ, there will be a setting free of the bondage of creation, which is in futility and mourns in travail because of us. That's neat. There's lots of other views of the end of the world, but That one is powerful. And you can make of it what you like. I try to suggest what I want to make of it. Now, I have lost my page. Here it is. So how did Christians come to believe in the fixity of species? Well, again, I don't want to flog Aristotle because Aristotle's defenders will have at me. But like many other ideas, it descended to us through medieval Christianity. Thomas Aquinas, very heavily influenced by Aristotle. Aristotle's doctrine of the forms, which control the development and change of things in the natural world, was an elaboration of Plato's ideas about the relation between the divine world of reason and the inferior material world we live in. The forms control the nature of living things in a determinate way, because that's how divine reason keeps things from going haywire. So we have the fixity of species. I claim this is a pagan idea, very far from Genesis' emphasis on God's intent of freedom for his creation. Well, I would have to say here, because it's relevant to the topic of these lectures, that generally speaking, intelligent design arguments follow Aristotle's doctrine of nature. And therefore, you don't have evolution. You might have microevolution, but you don't have macroevolution. Characteristics of a particular living thing, we know, are passed on to its descendants mainly through, quote, information in the genetic code, though that's hardly anything like the full story. We know much more today. And the question that we next ask, and these are questions that Randy, Isaac, and others in PSCF have asked, does the presence of information or, quote, specified complexity in the genetic system lead us to the conclusion that it must arise from an intelligent agent? And we had at that yesterday in the evening. I hope to say a bit more about this rather subtle point, but certainly anyone who argues for evolution as the process generating such complexity is obligated to offer alternative arguments in response. It's just like my Chinese student. God wouldn't be God. God wouldn't be sovereign if creation had that kind of liberty. You may feel that the liberty St. Paul is talking about is not necessarily the liberty to evolve, but I see it as a kind of continuum myself. Now, it is basic, of course, and I think I've finished page 2. It's a scientific inquiry, and if we're going to defend evolutionary ideas, we don't claim to understand the whole thing. We don't have a, quote, solution to the problem. One of the problems with evangelicals is that they want a solution to all problems in advance of a real understanding of them. And of course, that's not the way science works, and I would argue that it's not even the way Christian faith works. It's a strange and rather simple-minded idea. I also think it's premature, and here the biologists may have at me, in the science of biology to offer what we think is a full solution to this whole business. Lots of new stuff is happening all of the time. In evolutionary theory, if I were really aggressive, I would say it has very little meat on the bones, still. Now, one empty bit, and this is a part I'm not prepared to defend passionately at all, and I've always wondered about it just because I'm inherently a skeptic about such questions, is the claim that random mutations can account for genetic innovation. How do we know that? How might we know that most or all mutations are random? What we observe is a rate of mutation. And it seems the simplest thing to assume that it's random, but I don't know, and I'm not prepared to pontificate. In biology, experiments to test a hypothesis entail statistical decisions, just because we can't learn the important physical details from a single instance. One of the things I learned from Walter Elsasser, when he looks at differences between biology in the book, The Chief Abstractions of Biology, and I have a quote to that if you want to read it. It's not a tremendously good book. But in it he says, here's what I as a physicist react to or think about when I read about biology and look at what biologists talk about and do. And he's, of course, saying, among other things, it's different. And the question of what that difference is, of course, part of the issue that is controversial in this talk. I think up to now I've said things that are totally uncontroversial, or almost so. But today I'm making possibly things that might be controversial, and I'm happy that there's argument. Any claim, and I could put meat on those bones by simply talking about, you look at the range of variations in physical or chemical or other characteristics of any representative of a species or any generic claim you may make about the properties of biological organisms, and there are ranges in actual values of 30-40% from some average. And you have to recognize that that's true. That isn't quite like physics, except in certain very special situations. And so it's possible to argue, I'm not going to be passionate about it, any claim that an empirical hypothesis is true is always made in the context of the opposite conclusion, the null hypothesis, that it's just happened by chance. And that is always true in biological research. Hence, to argue positively for chance as an explanation is, in my view, perhaps an admission of ignorance. Now, I was brought up on physical science, and for me, the paradigm for the case where chance is clearly the explanation is statistical mechanics. Dead clearly, you don't need anything more than the most probable state to predict the thermodynamic properties of systems at equilibrium. That works. There's no need to doubt it. Now, it doesn't say that molecular collisions are chance events. Of course, they're controlled by the laws of physics, but you know the answer to the physicist to that, we don't need to know about that. It's unimportant, because overall the result is this. Now, the only exception, as I said, that's the exception. I don't think biological systems are treatable in this way. They're not simple like an ideal gas, okay? But that doesn't mean that statistics doesn't apply. It's just that it's much more difficult to do. And Randy probably knows a good deal more about this than I do. So, you know, there's a certain sneaking sympathy simply because I recognize that ID proponents are human beings like myself, to at least accept their claim that biology is complicated, even though I don't at all agree with them about their explanation for it. There's some richness in biology, and one of the things that I'm sort of going to get discussed today about is what do I mean by that? And I certainly don't mean anything transcendent or vitalist at all, and I want to make that clear, even though it may seem that I do. Now, argument about biological systems often stresses their complexity, and I made a survey of articles in PSCF. But complexity, I think, isn't the real issue. Many purely physical systems are also extremely complex. Some scientists, Stuart Kaufman is the person I'm thinking of, have tried to explain biological ordering and complexity by studying the behavior of self-organizing system, but while I haven't been immersed in that work, it appears to me that what seems to have come out of it is that we can certainly understand self-organization, the various cells that appear in a fluid that's being heated or other organized kinds of thing. And I had one of my students do study on classical dynamics in an actual molecular system because I didn't think stadium billiard offered much insight into the physical world. Those of you who are into that racket will understand my point. And we did a nice piece of work, but in the end, chaos sets in early. And the relationship between the classical mechanics and the quantum mechanics, while it has some points of real agreement, is not at all instructive. I don't know whether quantum chaos exists, and I'm not prepared to argue about it, but we didn't find any in the system we looked at. And so I would say, in an almost pontifical way, and open to correction, that while studies of the type that Stuart Kauffman and others have conducted about self-organizing systems, such studies seem more useful in explaining the emergence of higher levels of order in dynamical systems far from equilibrium, rather than the complex specific information that allegedly appears in biosystems. Now, a good example of purely physical complexity is, of course, the weather. And weather is a complex system. We first learned about classical chaos from the weather. The wonderful work done in the early days in recognizing that you can't predict the weather forever, even though it is a purely mechanical system. We have learned that predicting weather from microscopic physical principles is limited because of the butterfly thing. That is, that the system is so sensitive to very minute perturbations that you can't be sure. And I watched this happen in the hydrogen bifluoride ion system that we were studying. It was entertaining to see that happen. And there are things that are very stable points, and these, if you start a trajectory that heads towards such a stable point, all roads lead to Rome. They go there. But there are also unstable points, and I was asking myself as a quantum mechanician what relation they had to quantum states. Well, it turns out that they do have a relation. And while I'm not going to bore or put you to sleep as students, it is the case that there is a kind of correspondence between the repelling points in classical dynamics and the attractors. Good example is that if you have a resonance in quantum mechanics, there are two quantum levels with some certain dynamics cross. What will happen in quantum mechanics is that the levels will repel, and the lower level will stabilize, and the upper level will destabilize. Those are called curve crossings within atomic collision theory. Well, it turns out that the attractors in classical mechanics, if you haven't got chaos, correspond to the stable state, and the repeller turns out to correspond more or less to the dynamics of the unstable state. In quantum mechanics, both are stable. Enough said about this hairy stuff. It was fascinating to me. Now, I've talked about weather. I think weather forecasting introduced us to the incredible sophistication of physics when you put it into a complicated system. I had a grad student who worked with the meteorologists in Weather Canada, and what they needed was somebody who knew something about classical dynamics and about chemistry, and they hired her and gave her a job when she finished working with me on the classical motions in the bifluoride ion, precisely because she both knew the jargon that they talk, and she also knew some chemistry, and that was helpful. In weather, we certainly have complexity and detail that leads to definite, coherent, large-scale events that we talk about as rain, snow, wind, and in fact, we've had some nice illustrations of this in the last day or so. But we would never consider, unless we were joking, ascribing to the weather any achievement or task, would we? And there's all kinds of cargo hidden in that question. But I certainly don't think of the weather as performing any function unless I'm talking in the realm of natural theology, which the Bible certainly does. Biology, I say, is not like the weather. It's different. And I went so far as to be arrogant and say the biological complexity has something to do with what is achieved through such complexity, or what I call biological function. And I want to insist that I'm not trying to introduce any kind of transcendent, hidden thing that would violate physics or anything like that. I'm just saying that there's a different kind of organization than the apparent organizations that we can find in a purely physical system like the weather. Now, proponents of intelligent design also recognize this point, and a great many of their arguments about biology will be founded on that that issue and the pursuing of that issue, and they offer what I call a surrogate theological explanation. In other words, they're saying we'll introduce God here because we can't account for what we see without God as some kind of causer or origin of this organization. Now, in my view, that's not the right way to do, and I've made that clear in preceding lectures. I argue that instead we ought to think about what the ad hoc scope of naturalism should be. Lots of more stuff happens. The laws of physics still apply, but there's something else that you might want to think about. And I have some examples of thinking about it. Now, I need to get on. I argue the following, that lots of other concepts appear in papers on biology, and I have a couple of examples. I have also argued and will argue that one of the things you see happening in the language of people who write on these topics is paradigms taken from things that may not be the same thing at all, the paradigm of a machine. Michael Polanyi does that, and I discovered to my chagrin that he goes on to argue for vitalism. I have no intention of doing so. But the point is that there is an organization in a machine, and I have an example of Howard Berg using exactly the same language concerning the bacterial flagellum in E. coli. In fact, I brought that along in case you wanted to see whether he uses this kind of language or not, and he certainly does. What he means by it is the issue at debate. Howard Berg is professor of molecular biophysics at Harvard. Got his degree and PhD from Norman Ramsey. At about the time I first was a postdoc at Harvard, I didn't know him there, I knew him at Caltech. We were in the same course on mathematical physics taught by Richard Feynman, and I think I knew him there. We were part of a bunch of beavers who called the Feynman Integrals Club, and he was smarter than I am, I know that. But whereas he got interested in physics and then went into biology, I just stayed with physics, liked it, and stayed there all my career. Now, Michael Polanyi discusses this point, but then he says some things that I don't agree with, and I don't think you agree with them either, Randy, about vitalism. But to understand that something is a machine, you must look not only at the principles that it employs, but also how these are put together in a temporal spatial way so that it does whatever that machine does. And machines do all kinds of things, and I always think of my son and my high-speed grinder. I think it's Makita, and quite dangerous if you use it wrongly, but really does the job if you want to grind something. But you open that up, and there's quite an interesting and complicated mechanical and electrical arrangement of stuff that makes that machine work. And Polanyi's are here talking about machines, and I don't want to talk about biology in saying this necessarily. But he says, if we want to think something as a machine, we have to understand not only the physical principles that it embodies in its actions, but also a kind of logical conception of what it is doing and of the organization which is necessary in order to achieve that. And he calls them rules of rightness or rules of proper function, which govern what it is as a machine and what it does as a machine. Now, I would argue, I think, without question, that without knowing this kind of thinking about a machine, you can't understand that something is a machine. You have to have some notion of what it is supposed to be doing. Nor can you fix it if it's broken. I've tried fixing machines I didn't understand. It doesn't work well. My son's much better at that. He's an engineer. Polanyi says that the essential character of this rather mundane knowledge, and I want to stress that I think it's mundane, its logical independence of physics is shown by two very simple observations, and I'm not going to expound on them. Number one, a machine that's broken, one that does not function properly, does not do what the machine is supposed to do, and that is the situation that usually frustrates us, obeys the laws of physics perfectly. The levers work, All the electrical, mechanical aspects of it work, but it just doesn't work, doesn't do the job that it was built to do. And of course, I understand that machines are designed, and I'm not saying any such thing about biology. It's only an analogy. The second thing is what I've already said. For someone who does not understand that there is this higher order stuff, that's what you read in the instruction manual, the owner's manual. There's a whole lot of statements about button B and so on. And, it doesn't appear to be coherent as physical theory does. But you can't possibly repair a machine or understand what it's doing unless you read the manual. If all else fails, what's the rest of it? Read the instructions. And those instructions contain a kind of notion of how things should be put together. And of course, in some cases, I had a bicycle, or someone, no, it wasn't I, it was Robert Pirsig in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, where he gets this Japanese bicycle, and the instructions say, "Assemble of Japanese bicycle require great peace of mind." That's a lovely line. The rules require not only some patience in hearing what that's saying, but also recognizing that there's something extra here, and we can sure lose our temper if we don't understand that. And I do that very easily with machines because I'm just not an engineer. Now, I think everybody realizes the common sense truth of what I'm saying here, that there is something in addition to physics that you have to know if you want to take your grinder apart and repair it. It's not very profound. It certainly doesn't transcend in any meaningful sense the laws it uses, but it's essential if you want to fix the darn thing. Now, one of the points that is at issue in tonight's talk is whether I intended anything more than just asking you to recognize that such logic, which is in our minds, it isn't in the machine, it's not embodied except as we see it in the structure of the machine functioning properly. But I would respond to that by asking, are the laws of physics objectively real? Are they true? Are they objective as a description of reality? They're in our minds too. They exist in our minds, and yet we say they're true. And I want you to think about that puzzle, because I'm wholeheartedly committed to the laws of physics. I don't think they're divinely given, and I'm perfectly persuaded that there may be alternative formulations of physics which are utterly alien to my mind and language. Not concerned about that. But at least I have one representation of how the physical world behaves, which I believe is objective. It's coherent. And it more or less accounts for the phenomena. If you talk to somebody from the Middle Ages who saw our technology, he would think we were magicians. He or she. How do you know all this? Well, there's this regular order, these things, the character of physical life, we might jabber at him and he wouldn't understand us because he's not part of our culture. He would see us as magicians. And yet, we're not magicians. So are the laws of physics real? Yes. I think they are real or objective as a description. They're true in the limited sense that they describe, at present, the phenomena we're familiar with. There may be others to come. I don't know of any, but then the physicists at high energies are finding new weird things all the time. I don't want to expand on this point because it's time to come to an end. A number of important points have been made recently in the PSCF, in Perspectives on Science and the Christian Faith, and there's a string of 3 articles. But I'm going to start by talking about Dembski. William Dembski has argued that the total amount of information in a species' genome pool is conserved. And if this were true, it would permit microevolution or perhaps small changes, and that is why when you talk to people who are opposed to macroevolution, they will allow for microevolution because Dembski has led them to think that way. Since particular individuals could inherit sets of genes that might be better fitted to survive in a particular selective environment than either parent possessed. But what Dembski doesn't allow for is the generation of actually new information, because he claims that the total information in the gene pool is conserved. And so Dembski goes from there to arguing that there are mathematical limits on the amount of novelty available, and certainly one should not expect macroevolution. Lots of you probably have read this argument and maybe even have partially believed it. I don't. Research recently reported by Jonathan Watts and others has shown that genetic pool information is not conserved. And in fact, it can even be generated by completely mechanistic processes. He does snippets. He uses something he calls oligonucleotides, which are snippets either of living material or material that functions in living things, snippets of DNA or RNA or what have you, or completely synthetic products that are made up in a way that is not necessarily related to living creatures at all. Some of these are helical and some of them are not. But Watts has shown that perfectly natural processes, chemical processes in an in vitro, that means not in a living environment, will happen. They will pick up bits of protein or binding capacities to particular targets. And he talks about thrombin and binding to thrombin. And they will select for that because of the fact that random processes are happening, and that particular property of binding to thrombin, if it's selected for, it will survive. It's an interesting piece of work, and it certainly totally convinced me that Dembski is wrong. And so in this way, new, quote, information, and I'm not ridiculing the claim that it's information, is added. The other paper is a paper by, what's the other author's name? Freeland. And Freeland is interested in life in space and works in a laboratory that is committed to that whole question of whether we're going to find life in other worlds. And he's very interested in related processes, and he talks about some of the biochemistry there. And then the leading article in that same issue is by one of my respondents, Dr. Isaac, and he'll probably say anything he needs to say about that because I need to come to an end. But he talks about what the implications of the work by Watts and the work by Freeland is. And he argues, A, information is not conserved, it can be created, and B, that this happens by processes which are in no way directed. Is that fair? Yeah. Now, the other point that Dr. Isaac makes is that biological information is not abstract symbolic information, and I entirely agree. What do we mean by abstract symbolic information? Well, we're very sloppy in our language. We speak of the DNA code, but it isn't a code. It's a pattern which causes certain physical transformations to happen later in time and space in another system. That's all. There's no message and no programmer. And I'm with that. Fine. It is not abstract symbolic information. It's purely physical. The proteins are directly constructed by chemical and stereochemical processes, and in fact, there is not even any long-range interaction involved. It's all short-range stereochemistry. That was one of the problems for people's thinking about the helical structure when I was very young. So I could say more about this, but I shouldn't. Finally, is biology different from the physical sciences? The weather isn't organized like a machine. I hope I've persuaded you of that. It accomplishes nothing. I look at the language of research work, and I find that terminology describes complex biomolecules using names like receptor, messenger, trigger. I know these are lovely names, and they do describe what we think is happening. Should we abandon them? Should we say that this description is not, even though it's based purely on analogy, is not valid? I'd be interested in responses here. I'm not going to dictate. There are terms like inhibitor or activator that any chemist knows about, but they don't carry that cargo philosophically at all. The molecular components enabling biological functions are described by roles that we see them playing in what we describe as the machine-like overall function of a biosystem. And words used have meaning in that context. And I think that's the context in which Michael Behe's notion of irreducible complexity has any sort of meaning at all. It's in that context. Now, I have a couple of slides which are wazoo slides because they show a couple of items, and I want the first one, which contains two pictures. Have you got it? This is from an article by Howard Berg, professor of biophysics. This picture is a rotationally averaged electron micrograph, and for you that Greek means that electron micrographs have taken, but then there were lots of them, and the thing had to be rotationally averaged. But you see that this sort of looks like that. And that's all I want to say about it. David DeRosier at Brandeis took that picture. I've corresponded with him, and I got his permission to use that as the original. I thought David had drawn this diagram. That turns out not to be true, and he doesn't even know who drew it. But it appears in a number of articles, and this is what you're looking at. The little quote motor, and I'll put quotes around it because I know that this is the issue at hand, and Howard describes it that way, which runs the filament. And there's all kinds of technical stuff in that article, and I have a copy of Howard Berg's article from Physics Today explaining that to us laymen in the field. It's quite interesting, and I want to, if you're interested and you don't believe me about this language, Howard can't describe this system without using the language of machines to describe it. Rotors, motor, it goes on like that. And what it really is, of course, not a machine. There's no human designer. I wouldn't for a minute suggest that. But why is it that we can't invent a totally new language? Or why don't we want to? Because the analogy is apt. That's all. That's all I intend. I hope that's fairly minimalist. See, where I made things difficult was by introducing this point about technology and philosophy, teleology and philosophy. That one I wish I'd left out because it raises too many red rabbits that run off in the wrong direction. But I do believe that such an apparatus as you see here is irreducibly complex, in that in order to work, to do what it does, whether you call it a motor or not, in order to do what it does, it has to be put together with the chemicals that power it in a particular way. In fact, Howard goes so far as to say it's an electric motor. Gee whiz. Now, I'm not so simple-minded as to take all that we might infer from such a statement, but it looks as though the language of people like Professor Berg is happy to borrow from these usages, which have come, in fact, from machines that we design. I abhor and detest and reject the notion that they're designed. I don't believe it. But there is an analogical similarity. And I think it's significant that the best convenient way for Professor Berg to write about this thing in a 7-page article is to use that kind of language. I would love to hear him say why he should do that rather than invent some completely new and totally technical language which does the same description. Don't know. Now, the authors of this article, and there's another slide which shows you, I have a second slide. This is a schematic diagram, and I absolutely don't expect you to understand it, of the apparatus, the chemical apparatus, which achieves photosynthesis, not in chlorophyll in plants, but in certain photosynthetic bacteria. They're purple in color, and the pigments are slightly different. But basically what this contraption does, I know it looks like bear traps or something, but it's not. Those are all rather complicated molecules that make up these different rings. But with this contraption, and again here my language is potentially very loaded, but what happens in this contraption, as happens in chlorophyll, is that the system sits there, and the time scale is very short, but a photon, there's not much ultraviolet around. The task, if you like, or the end of the process is the construction of a chemical, in some cases ATP, I don't know what it is in this case, that can perform it provides chemical energy to a living thing. But if you wanted to do that with one photon, it takes a photon in the ultraviolet, and there's not a lot of that in the Earth's atmosphere. And so what this contraption and chlorophyll do is that they take what's available. They absorb 2 visible photons. I think of different wavelength in this case, although I don't recall. And what happens is that photon 1 is absorbed, and then photon 2 is absorbed in a very short time, and all of a sudden something goes ka-ching. The energy is transferred in an exciton-like fashion to a place where chemical synthesis occurs, and the quantum energy in 2 photons is used to produce this biologically necessary result, something like ATP. Now, I don't pretend to understand this thing's origin or how it came to be, and I regard that as an interesting mystery which is open to scientific inquiry. There are no spooks in the machine, as far as I'm concerned. I want to make that perfectly clear. On the other hand, it is incredibly weird, this complexity. And I think that's where I would defend might be. There is such a thing as irreducible complexity. Take a part away and it won't work. Doesn't do the job. I draw no inferences about design. I want to insist on that. I'm just interested in the fact that this complicated thing exists. We'll probably spend at least decades and possibly centuries coming to fully understand it. But my point is complicated stuff, and I marvel at it and say, wow. And I'm sure all scientists do. But it is in no way mundane, you see. I don't know how such an apparatus comes to be, but anybody who works on it has to be utterly fascinated and amazed. And there's, of course, lots of room for natural theology there. If you're an intelligent designer, you might do that. Or you might have other various weird ideas. I decline the opportunity, and that's what I mean, Randy, when I say I'm a minimalist. I don't make any assertions about why this thing exists, other than that I do believe in natural theology that God is the creator of all things. And I have no view of how he meddles around with creation. Enough said.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thorson, for these wise words of your clear articulation of the awe and wonder of biology is impressive. And we share your passion for science. We're inspired by it, as well as your love of God and your focus on integrating science and faith. Now, in these lectures, and perhaps some earlier versions and drafts of this lecture that many of you have not had a chance to read, but they've altered a little bit here. But Dr. Thorson has raised a most important question for us, and if I may, I'd like to rephrase that in the following sense. He's asking, does the organizational structure in biology lead us to infer that biology is more than physics and chemistry? Okay, so that's the legitimate formulation of your question. Now, I believe he has humbly suggested that perhaps, maybe, the answer might be yes. And I would offer, partly for the sake of argument, but partly because that's how I feel, is that the answer might be perhaps no. And so I'd like to present, to some extent, a little bit of differing views and why this might be the case. Now, in his talk tonight, Dr. Thorson quickly backtracked from his use of the word teleology, which occurred in his first few drafts. I will continue to follow that rabbit trail a little bit because it is still instructive for us, and I think we can still articulate a little bit of what Dr. Thorson is saying. Teleology is a very important concept and one which has often been offered to articulate what is more than physics and chemistry in the biology. I would like to contrast that tonight with a concept of emergence. And so in the very few minutes we have remaining, I'd like to take these two very complex concepts, teleology and emergence, and try to explain and critique and maybe compare them in this context of whether or not there is more in biology than physics and chemistry. Now, in teleology, there are four different aspects we have to be careful of. One is, well, first I should say teleology has a connotation of intention and purpose. Really that there's an end goal. That's the essence of what it is. And there are several ways in which this can manifest itself. First of all, it could be an external agent. Some external agent has an intent or purpose for this system. And that is the direction of William Paley. That's the direction the intelligent design community has gone. And Dr. Thorson affirms, as do I, that this is not a valid direction. And much has been written elsewhere about why this ID perspective fails on scientific, philosophical, and theological grounds, so I will not pursue that here. A second application here would be an internal agent, that the system itself has cognitive ability and is capable of self-realization. And I'm sure we all understand this is not what Dr. Thorson means, and so we can dispense with that possibility. Now, a third possibility that he did mention is that of the Aristotelian notion of forms, that there exists some ideal form to which systems aspire to achieve their destiny or their goal. And again, Dr. Thorson has clearly articulated this is not the case in these biological systems. But rather, he has taken a fourth perspective, which he has described to me earlier and briefly alluded here as a minimalist teleology. What is minimalist teleology? I'm not sure I know, but I believe he is saying that there's an indication of intent and purpose and function in this logical structure of biology, but we don't really know what this is. Not quite. All right. But you wish, but I won't let you forget it because it's too much fun to discuss in this way. But nevertheless, he's saying there's something about this function and this structure here that is different in some way, and that part of the biological research program is to seek and understand what this something is that goes beyond physics and chemistry. Now, to substantiate his case, he has articulated two things tonight. One is the analogy to machines, following the path of Michael Polanyi. And as you heard him just say, is the analogy between the machine and the biology. And I'm pleased to say that he did back off on the strength of that analogy. In my opinion, there are fundamental reasons why this analogy does not hold, and that the core functions and nature of the machines are different. And so the analogy is not persuasive to me. Secondly, he pointed to teleological language, or which is the point that he emphasized most of all today. And I agree that it frequently creeps into the language of science, but I would say, in my opinion, that such teleological language does not reflect a reality of any sense of teleology, but rather the reality that we as finite human beings need familiar images and concepts in order to describe very complex phenomena. But let me take a couple of minutes, if I may, to talk about emergence. Philosopher Tim O'Connor defines emergence in this way, quote, "Emergent entities, properties or substances, arise out of more fundamental entities and yet are novel or irreducible with respect to them," unquote. That is, the interaction of components gives rise to new entities and new processes that do not exist if those same components are considered independently in a non-interacting mode. So there are several kinds of emergence, and of course we need to define it carefully. There are those who go to one extreme and use emergence to try to explain the divine or the sacred in terms of the material world. That's one end of the extreme that I think we can set aside. We're not going there. At the other extreme, we have the very simple notions in physical sciences where I believe there's no disagreement whatsoever. I think everyone agrees that there is a set of emergence in these levels where you have your basic elementary particles, which each element, like electrons and quarks, which to our knowledge are not composed of any smaller component. But then at each level of hierarchy, whether it be protons, be nuclei, atoms, molecules, they are all composed of components, but they themselves comprise entities that can have causal effects upon their components. This is really emergence, but it's of the simple kind. Where the interesting part comes is in between these extremes. We have two fascinating arenas of discussion. One is the question of whether consciousness or intelligence or reasoning or even love, joy, and peace, whether these might be understood from the underlying material components. Now, time is too short. I can't answer that. So that's an exercise left to the students. And if you solve it, I believe you'll be able to graduate immediately. But the other question of relevance here today is whether biological systems, and we'll just keep simple biological systems here, whether they can be accounted for by the underlying physics and chemistry, or whether this novelty can really be understood as an emergent property, or whether there is really something else that is there, whatever that might be. I believe that Dr. Thorson thinks there's a little something more, and I do not. Now, how can we resolve this question, which for now I'll use the term teleology, but the minimalist form, teleology and emergence? Perhaps we cannot decide. Why not? Because neither teleology nor emergence is really a scientific explanation, and it doesn't lend itself to evidential support. These are really philosophical frameworks that help to guide the direction of our scientific endeavor. Now, if either approach were to contribute to our understanding of biology in a way that is excluded by the other, we might settle the argument. In my opinion, the teleological aspect has not yet been productive in leading to the correct research. But if I may, in a couple of minutes here, I'd like to suggest that we could shed light on this problem by rephrasing the question in yet another way. And rather than asking, does the organizational structure in biology lead us to infer that biology is more than physics and chemistry, we could ask the question in this way. What is the source of the information that determines the organizational structure in biology? Just a slight modification of the wording here, but perhaps by examining the flow of information, we can differentiate between the teleology and emergence. And here I would suggest that there's a key difference between teleology and emergence in the following sense, that in teleology implies that such information about the design exists in a static a priori sense, while emergence implies that the information is dynamic and a posteriori in nature. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, I would say that a machine generally achieves a function that is specified by some design that exists independent of and prior to the construction and operation of the machine. There's an a priori blueprint, which could be a detailed design drawing or it's an intuitive concept, but there is a guiding reference design. This is the pre-existing information, frozen in time, if you will. It's a static ideal. But in contrast, in the framework of emergence, information arises as a consequence of the interaction of the components, so that this successful information set is evident afterward, rather than existing as an intentional prior concept. Now, as we heard from Dr. Story yesterday, the primary, if not the sole function of a biological system is to self-replicate. But there can be no prior blueprint of the information set needed for successful self-replication because the conditions for self-replication depend strongly on a dynamic system-environmental interaction that occurs later in time and is spatially separated from the process that forms the biological system. For example, take a simple single-cell organism, to keep it as simple as possible. Now, to successfully self-replicate, it must be formed initially with the correct information, and by this we mean the DNA sequence as well as all the epigenetic factors and all the shape of the molecules and all of this. But that information cannot be known with sufficient precision to serve as a blueprint since at the time of the formation of that single cell, there is insufficient information available concerning the dynamically changing environment in which the cell will need to replicate in some time in the future. Now, the flow of information follows the arrow of time, and there is no feedback to convey what is the correct set of information. Hence, there is no a priori blueprint that can exist for this cell, and, in my opinion, any, even a minimalist type of teleological perspective is inadequate. But how would this work in emergence? Well, first, I think we need to recognize that biological systems must always be considered in terms of populations rather than individual entities. Evolution works on populations, not really on individuals. And we must consider not just an individual single-cell organism, but an entire large population of such cells with sufficient variation to constitute a somewhat random, and the randomness is important, and I look forward to many good discussions with you on this point. That's right, we've got a lot of years left, of different information sets. Now, with such a starting point, it is likely that a subset will emerge with the right characteristics for successful self-replication. This is known as natural selection, and we'll hear more about that from our next respondent. Now, this selected set is not known and cannot be known in an a priori sense, but it is dynamically selected in an a posteriori sense after the fact. It can't be known in advance what is correct, but you can respond to that dynamic change only later. And for these reasons, I would suggest that emergence is a more relevant paradigm for looking at biology than teleology, and in that context, I would suggest that the physics and chemistry is indeed adequate, and the focus of biological research needs to be directed in that way. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot to all of you for coming, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's great to be back here. I haven't been back enough to Gordon. I think I've been in this very place, well, actually probably about 30 feet above the middle of the room 20 years ago when it was Wood Residence Hall, and I was visiting my brother in his dorm. Well, actually, yeah, I guess I'm supposed to say I was visiting my brother because it's being recorded, but if it weren't being recorded, I would say I was just getting him out of trouble. But anyway, this used to be a residence hall here. It's great to be in this wonderful new building. I appreciate Dr. Thorson's careful thought about biological function and organization towards function, and then the new and interesting way in which Dr. Isaac responded to those ideas. I'd like to take this track a little bit further and talk about two things. One is levels of explanation in biology, because this has come up both yesterday and today, but no one has actually outlined what these, how these work, and I think it's necessary in order for us to address these issues. And then also, what is left when evolution has had its way with this goal-directedness idea that Dr. Thorson has been very careful to eschew. So, the evolutionary, in terms of levels of selection in biology, the evolutionary biologist Julian Huxley so that all behavior can be studied from 3 different perspectives, because he noticed people were arguing with each other. And then so he said, well, look, actually there are 3 complementary perspectives or levels at which you can explain behavior in biology. And I would say that this isn't true just of behavior, although it's generally accepted within the behavioral biology community, but it is understandable with respect to any trait of any organism. So his first one was physiology, or what we might call mechanical causation of behavior. Why did I jump off the cliff? Oh, well, my brain sent electrical impulse to my muscle, etc. That's not the kind of answer that you would expect, but physiologists like those kinds of answers. And then there's a second way that you can address explanation of any trait, and that is through function. This is what I study, has to do with adaptation. Much of evolutionary biology today is about this, explaining why things work in terms of the history of natural selection acting on those and what they do. And then third is evolutionary history. Those are what paleontologists, systematists, and other evolutionary biologists, recent imports into evolutionary biology, relatively speaking, about 50 or 60 years ago, they became evolutionary biologists, but they did their job long before that. And that is just documenting the history of the when we saw these things arise. And phylogeny is what that is called. Now, the Dutch ethologist Nicolaas Tinbergen added a fourth, and that is ontogeny, development. It's amazing that we went all the way until the 60s before somebody thought to add development to what we could study in biology. But anyway, these approaches are complementary to each other. Each must be taken in order to understand the full biological significance of any trait, and to disagree across these lines doesn't really make any sense because they are different kinds of answers to the question of why. If biologists had devised the English language a long time ago, they would have had 4 different questions of why, and then we wouldn't have this problem. But anyway, I would add an additional, it's essentially the same phenomena being studied just with different glasses on, so to speak. Now, I would add an additional level for people in this room because we are interested in other aspects of biological systems besides those 4 more mundane ones. And that is, one is agency. And all I'm meaning by adding agency as a perspective or a way that you can study a trait or an organism is that it's complementary and yet distinct from the other levels. We can study behavior at the level of individual decisions for reasons, say. And so in at least some traits in organisms, we can address things from that perspective, regardless of what you think about free will, and the conclusions will be just as distinctive and interesting as conclusions at any other level. And then, for those of you who are open to something even different and more abstract from that, and even more removed from the science, because biology actually cannot deal with agency at this point, and maybe never will. Another level or perspective that could be added to these 5 now would be one of ultimate purpose. Even if you are an atheist, still you cannot deny the fact that we can study any trait of any organism, any population, or any behavior of humans, for instance, in terms of ultimate purpose. A major aspect of religion is the imbuing of the creation, including humanity, with purpose and destiny. By imbue, I don't mean to say that we're doing it with our religion, but religion is, and spirituality are the areas in which we reflect on our ability to entertain ideas about ultimate purpose. And so, any organism or trait could be analyzed in relation to that idea too. Now, let's take for granted that you like, or at least are willing to grant for the sake of argument, these different levels of explanation or different perspectives that are complementary to each other but cannot yield results at any other level. If so, then where is teleology or function or goal-directedness in these areas? I would say it's present to some extent in all of them. In the fourth, there are 2 that are very uncontroversial, and so we'll leave those aside. Agency is what we plan for everything, and ultimate purpose is what God plans for everything. We can set those aside. And what we have left are the kinds of goal-directedness that are present in organisms that science can countenance. Now, what do we do with those? What's left is what is at issue today, which is mostly function. I would say that there is also a goal-directedness in development, and some people would say, not me, but that there is some sort of goal-directedness in the path of evolution, evolutionary history. But anyway, let's look at function more closely, because it's the one that most people talk about, and since intelligent design is being brought up, that's the thing that they most don't understand. And so what's responsible for function in biology? Now, the root answer to this question for me, and of course this is what I study, so of course I'm going to say this, is that either indirectly or directly in every known case so far, the function of a trait results from the action of natural selection. There is no other mechanism known to science. I'm open to them if you want to propose one, but there is no mechanism known to science besides natural selection that can produce functional integration. What I mean by that is refinement of the parts of a system in such a way that they better accomplish something of benefit to that system. There's nothing but natural selection that can effect that. There are things that are products of natural selection that can then in turn effect that, such as individual plasticity. But natural selection is still needs to be invoked. Now, natural selection is only goal-directed in a potentially misleading sense. So when we talk about teleology and evolution, people in evolutionary biology frown on that. And the reason for that is that teleology is usually reserved for, or goal-directedness, which is just an English sort of translation of that word that we might use in popular settings. But the reason why we frown on the use of that term is because we reserve that term for situations in which the purpose or intention to do something is inherent in the thing itself, not imposed upon it. And so what we have done is just abandon the notion of teleology in evolution, including in natural selection, but we still maintain some sort of goal-directedness. Now, how do we do that? And there have been proposals by both previous speakers as to how we might do that. Well, the way that we do it within evolutionary biology is we have this concept of teleonomy. Julian Huxley also invented that word. And what that means is there's a goal-directedness that's not inherent in the organism or the trait itself, but is a result of the way that that organism or trait functions in the broader system that includes the environment and laws that regulate the action of the environment on the organism over many generations. So in other words, there's this big system, like a conveyor belt, so to speak, that we call natural selection that moves organisms and traits in certain directions. But the goal-directedness is not inherent in those organisms or traits themselves. So we can't use the term goal-directedness. There's not some magical idea of wanting to become better. This idea of more evolved, less evolved, the Star Trek notion of higher, more evolved species don't war against each other and more cooperative. None of that stuff is relevant here because there's nothing inherent to the organism that is resulting in the movement forward. The movement forward is because of a cyclic interaction between the environment that impacts the organism in such a way that only some variants will survive. Then in the next generation, the organism is better fit to the environment, and the same thing happens again, time and time and time again. What do you see at the end of it? These interesting structures grow, sometimes in complexity, sometimes not, but always grow in fitness to the environment, meaning that they more and more appear as though they were designed to function in that environment. Because in a sense, they were designed to function in that environment, but in this cyclic kind of sense of that natural selection is responsible for. Now, I just want to conclude with two quality control points here. One is that there are some concerns that have been raised today and yesterday about the momentous conclusion that mutations are random. And unfortunately, that was just as a result of a miscommunication between evolutionary biology and lots of writers, more popular writers often from other other fields, but it's an unfortunate thing that this has happened, and it's deep into the literature now, but I'll just try here, and I've tried elsewhere, to try to get rid of that miscommunication, because evolutionary biologists are kind of confused when they think that this is a momentous conclusion. So I'll just say, when evolutionary biologists say that something is random, particularly evolutionary ecologists, people who are studying adaptation, natural selection, that kind of thing, they only mean one thing, and it is not randomness in the sense that is generally requires a distribution and statistical analysis. All that they mean is that the causes of the mutations are not related causally to the results when that organism is in its environment. That's the only thing they mean by mutations being random. So the only thing you need to know in order to know whether mutations are random or not is whether any of the causes, and we know some of the causes of mutation, and we know there are causes, so nobody's appealing to some just, nebulous notion of chance or something, but there are causes, but the question is whether any of those causes can be found in the environment where that function will take place, or the change in function that are a result of the mutations. And we can say that we have never found that to be the case. We've never found where the thing that changes the organism feeds back and affects the mutation that happened previously. That never happens, so we can say that mutations are random only in that sense.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Okay. And then the second quality control point, and I think I'm over my time already, but I'll just try to rush through this here, is that the claims of intelligent designers and others that mainstream evolutionary theory, including natural selection and all of the things that have been built onto it, can't possibly explain a functional trait. I hear this all the time. It's part of why Behe invented the term of irreducible complexity, if that is his term. I don't know. But this is not ever, in my experience, a cogent argument or a scientific hypothesis, but it's always an expression of frustration at the limitation of knowledge and imagination. And I don't mean to make fun of any individual people here. I'm talking as a society, as a human. I don't mean we haven't discovered traits that aren't explainable by natural selection. We have discovered many traits. I was just discussing today how it's very possible that the turning of color of leaves in the fall is a trait of plants that we can understand without invoking natural selection directly. But they're not functional, that's the point. In every case where someone says that a functional trait can't have evolved by natural selection, it's never a scientific statement. There's never a way to tell whether that criticism is true. Try it out. If there's a way to falsify that statement or tell whether it's true or not, then I will accept that it's a scientific statement. And also, in most specific cases where it's been raised so far, it's been shown to be false. And it also doesn't provide any alternatives. So why is this happening? Well, the reason it's happening is because we as scientists, it's my fault too, because in my first few years of teaching science, I have done this myself, we focus our teaching of science on the testing aspect and on the implications aspect, the methods and the methods and results part of your scientific paper. But scientific method is always a cycle, and what happens at the top? That's hypothesis generation. And in biology, that's extremely difficult to do, and it gets more and more difficult the more and more we know. And so the problem here is that it is very difficult to come up with hypotheses sometimes to explain things that are functional in terms of, for instance, how they arose. But I would just ask us all that if we can't come up with a hypothesis, let's please allow others to try and be a little bit modest about it, and rather than being sour grapes as we might all want to tend to be and make a pronouncement that it can't be done at all. Thank you very much.